पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते।
It was mentioned that non-violent communication in expressing our wants and realities doesn't really work when we haven't addressed our own illusion of duality. How do we address this perceived duality and cultivate true non-violent communication? Well, let's take it basic first. The question sounds like communication PhD. Like sort of it sounds like it assumes a prerequisite of some terms and some concepts. So let's begin at the basics and then work our way up to the topic, the actual question. When we say non-violent communication, what do we mean? There is now whole schools of study and practice and teaching on it. There's schools of study and practice and teaching on something very similar called conscious communication. Different term, very, very similar concepts. In order to be non-violent, one has to be conscious. If you're conscious, presumably you're going to be non-violent. What does it really mean, though? What are we really looking at? And when we speak about a concept of duality, well, that duality is this illusion of separation. The difference between you and me. So backing up another step, in the Indian spiritual tradition, there's really two very general schools. There's hundreds of lineages and schools within this, but two very, very basic schools. One is the school of non-duality, the Advaita Vedanta school that says there is nothing but God. It's not even a matter of one God. People walk into Indian spiritual tradition and talk about, oh, there's so many gods. It's a polytheistic religion. Then you get to know it's not. They're actually all just manifestations of the same reality. But actually the truth is even further. It's not one God, many manifestations. It's actually nothing but God, which is different than one God. When most of us think of one God, we think of all of us here, and then one God somewhere sitting in heaven, or as Puja Swamiji likes to say, on cloud 9. Sitting up there and, looking down on us. But actually the teaching, the real depth of the teaching is there's nothing but God. That's the non-dual tradition. That's the depth of the spiritual philosophy. The dualistic path is a path of love, of devotion. It's a path where you have the beloved, the divine, the lover, us. Now, if you talk to people who are deep on a path of devotion and love, who are hardcore dualists, what you really find is they know it's all God. It's not that they actually believe that they're so separate from God on a core level, but being in love feels so beautiful. There's something very, very beautiful about love and devotion. And so when we speak about the dualist path, it's not that they really think that God is somewhere, out there and we're here. it's that it's very difficult to be in love with yourself on a very deep spiritual way and enjoy the bhakti, enjoy the love, enjoy the devotion. I mean, it's hard to start a practice of writing yourself songs and poems and, singing to yourself on the subway. So there's something very beautiful about being in love. But they know it's all God. So that was Indian spiritual philosophy in 30 seconds. But it was important because when we speak about non-duality, well, what does that mean? That's the core of what non-duality is. And so if we say there's nothing but God, and it doesn't matter what word or concept or language we use for that, it's utterly irrelevant. That infinite reality. If there is nothing but that, then you and I are not separate. So the concept of violence becomes a moot point. I'm harming myself if I harm you. And this is where actually our practice of meditation is so important, because you can intellectually get we're one. It's all soul, it's all spirit, it's all God. But that's a very, very difficult thing to live with if you haven't experienced it. That's something very, very hard to hold in your consciousness if you haven't had that experience. And so this is where meditation is so important. But I want to come back to the communication aspect, because long before we get to the ultimate experience of oneness with the universe, we can be nonviolent. We can be conscious in our communication. It's not a matter of, well, only those of you who have really worked through your whole dualistic illusion, only those of you who really can see the self in others are going to be able to communicate in a nonviolent and conscious way. And that's just not true. So what I would say from working from the ground up is, in order to have nonviolent communication, we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of this communication? In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna emphasizes that right speech, dharmic speech, what he calls tapas of speech, has to fulfill 3 criteria. It must be true. It must also be kind and beneficial. And so a lot of times, particularly in the West, it's not nearly as much like this in India, but particularly in the West, we tend to believe that just because something is true, it has to be said. And that's just not true. No pun intended, really. That's according to the teachings of Lord Krishna. I mean, that's not what I grew up with. I grew up with a truth at all costs. If it's true, it must serve the higher good. If it's true, it doesn't matter if it's kind, it doesn't matter if it's beneficial. I wasn't even thinking on those levels. Truth is the highest goal. My favorite personal story on this, which I'll share just to give you a little opportunity to laugh and understand why truth in and of itself isn't always the highest goal. When I was my last year of high school, I was 17. I was in love, and in love with a young man who was a year older than I was, and he had gone off to college. And it was my first love, and when you're 16 or 17, it's soulmates. I mean, there's a power to being in love as a teenager that I don't think ever comes back quite with that surety and that intensity. And my dad and I, now my dad's a divorce attorney, And at that point, so I was 17, he had spent a couple of decades, now he has spent many decades, divorcing people. It's all he does, morning till night. And we're sitting at dinner, and my dad says to me, so what's going to happen with you and Eric now that he's gone off to college? And I said, well, we're soulmates, of course, so we're going to be together forever with the surety that you only have when you're 16 or 17. And I said, but we're going to have an open relationship. And my dad said, oh, tell me about that. And I said, well, we're going to stay together forever, but we're each going to date other people, and then we're going to tell each other about it. So my dad said, and you have to just know my dad, who was just the epitome. I mean, for a man who has never meditated, he embodies what people spend decades meditating to get to. So my dad says, so let me get this straight. He says, you're going to date other people, then you're going to tell each other about it, and you're going to stay together forever. And I said, yeah, of course. And my dad said, in really what to me is just parenting Hall of Fame material, he said, well, that sounds very interesting. I look forward to hearing how that works out for you. Needless to say, it didn't work out quite as well as we had anticipated. But I love that story because in a nutshell, it really is the two camps of truth. It's true, therefore it must be spoken. And therefore speaking it is in the highest service of life and the spiritual teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, which is, okay, wait, that may be true. Is it kind? Is it beneficial? And a lot of times in our communication with people, we say things that we preface with, I know you're not going to want to hear this, but, or I know this is probably going to hurt you, but, or I really hope you're not going to be hurt by what I'm going to say because I have to tell you because it's true, but. And any time you begin a sentence like that, you really need to ask yourself, what is the point of this communication? Why do we have communication? I mean, if you were God, why would you invent communication? Why would we be given vocal cords? What does communication do? It serves a purpose. I mean, I cannot imagine that in the act of creation, somehow the divine had this image of us sitting around and just gossiping for hours on end. Oh, I know what they're going to do with those vocal cords. Or there's a purpose to communication. It should solve something. It should bring us closer. It should clarify things. It should explain things. I mean, there's 100 purposes of communication. One of them is not, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm unable to digest something. And a lot of times we use communication because I would much rather that this mess falls in your lap than I have to keep it in me. And if I can share the mess, if I can, vomit the mess literally all over you, I'm going to feel better. And it's a two-part problem because first of all, it's an illusion that I'm going to feel better. You don't actually solve anything internally simply by dumping it on somebody else. And very rarely is it met with a positive and beneficial response. But a lot of times that's what communication is. You have said something, you have done something, or the universe has said or done something that has made me feel a certain way. Rather than looking inward, my first instinct is to go outward. And this is why the very, very first step of nonviolent and conscious communication is the communication you have with yourself. If I can't be conscious with myself, I cannot be with you. And so that which you said has triggered in me an issue I have, a wound I have, an aspect of the identity through which I'm moving through the world. This happens. Welcome to our day-to-day life. You know, we're just moving through the world, and the next thing you know, you've hurt somebody you didn't mean to. The very first aspect of communication has to be with myself if it's going to be effective. So if I go within and I say, okay, this person said this or did this, or didn't say that or didn't do this, I feel hurt. But before I vomit that on you, before I turn you into the reason that I'm upset, before I make this about what you did, can I ask myself, this is really interesting. This is really interesting. And I highly, highly recommend, from a very personal level and lots of personal experience, the this is really interesting approach to whenever you feel upset and hurt and triggered. If you can go within, even the other person was totally rude, even they were absolutely uncalled for. Lots of people do lots of things that are rude, that are uncalled for. But we don't get hurt by all of them. We're not hurt by everything everyone says that's selfish or rude. We're only hurt by some things that some people do. And that's because of our own karmic package. It's because of our life experience. The wounds we have, the triggers we have, the complexes we have, the identities we have. And so when we get triggered, the very first important aspect of communication is, that's really interesting. Why am I so triggered? And so if you're going to take that communication to another person, what I would say the nonviolent communication would look like, and of course, it can't be a cookie cutter because there's an infinite number of possibilities of situations, but it would look something like, first of all, is this a good time to share something with you? It's always important to ask. People have their own lives, their own karmic packages, their own triggers. So it's always important. Is this a good time to share? And then if it is, something really interesting happened today. You said this, or you did this, or that other person said this, or that other person did this. And I was so triggered. And here's what that looks like within me. It looks like you don't care about me. It looks like I'm worthless. It looks like I don't matter. And so I'll give you an example. Let's take an everyday, very simple example. I'm doing the dishes. I always do the dishes. I say to you, why don't you help me do the dishes? You always promise you're going to help me do the dishes. Why don't you help me? You're so selfish. Again today, after dinner, you went and you watched TV. But every day you say you're going to help me with the dishes. Now, I may say it nicely. Maybe I've taken a course in nonviolent communication, or I've started yoga. Okay, be nice. Honey, again today, you watched TV instead of helped me with the dishes. Honey, that really makes me angry. Okay, so on some level, that's nonviolent, right? I mean, I didn't yell at you, I didn't hit you, I didn't take the dishes and throw them on your head and say, fine, if you're not going to wash them, I'll break them on your head. I said it very nicely, but I wouldn't give that the stamp of nonviolent conscious communication, because it's still about what you've done or haven't done being the reason I'm angry. And that's just not true. It's triggered something, but the anger's within me. Because lots of people don't do dishes. Doesn't make me angry. Lots of people live in homes where other people don't do the dishes. It doesn't make them angry. There's some things we know. You take a knife, you cut me, I'm going to bleed. Cut you, you're going to bleed. Cut you, you're going to bleed. This is the law of nature. But me being angry because the person I live with or cooked for or brought dinner for doesn't help me clean dishes is not a law of nature. It's triggered something in me. So the first thing I would do is I would say, okay, this is really interesting. Why am I fuming? Why am I fuming? Here I am doing the dishes. Why am I so angry that I'm not even able to digest this wonderful dinner I just had? Why is my face red? Water's cold, my hands are hot. Why am I so upset? Such that by the time you go to that person, you're able to say, you know, here's something really interesting. When you don't help me do the dishes, it makes me feel like I don't matter to you. Like you don't care. And you know, that's a really deep trigger for me, because when I was growing up, in my family, my brother, who was older and he was the boy, he got all the privileges, he got taken everywhere. I was sort of an afterthought. And so, you know, I've kind of moved through the last 20 or 30 or 50 years of my life working with this feeling of being not enough, unappreciated. And it's so interesting that when you don't help me do the dishes, it triggers that in me. And since I'm still working to overcome it, I'm not quite there yet. It would be so wonderful if you wouldn't mind helping me, because to have to relive this every night in my mind, I know that that's not why you don't help me. I know you love me. But nonetheless, because of the karmic package I've moved into this situation with, simply having to do the dishes alone stirs up all that in me. I would call that nonviolent and conscious communication. And you then have to be prepared that when the other person says, wow, thanks for sharing. You know, I'm never going to help you do the dishes, but I would love to help you work through this. Can we talk? And here's why I'm not going to help you do the dishes. And here's my story. Or right after dinner, you know, it's my favorite show and here's why it's so important to me. And if you did the dishes, if you wouldn't mind leaving them in the sink for an hour, I'd be happy to help you an hour later. But whatever it is, you then have to say, are you prepared? Because nonviolent communication is also two-directional. It's not just that which I say is nonviolent. So I say it lovingly, then you say, well, you know, I really can't help because it's my TV show. I knew it, you hate me. No, right? So the receiving end is also nonviolent. The receiving end is also conscious. Just as I've been triggered, just as I've had an emotional reaction, well, so the other person is entitled to have one. And so nonviolent communication, I think, is rooted in, that's interesting. So it's with myself. And then it's rooted in an awareness that every single person has their own karmic package, is moving through the world with it. And just as I want people to dance according to the tune of my karmic package, I want what I want, when I want it, how I want it, or else. Well, everybody wants that. And obviously we can't do that for each other, which means that we're going to keep being triggered and we're going to keep having reactions. And it's okay. It's part of human life and existence and relationships. It's what keeps marriage counselors and divorce lawyers in business. But the communication we have with ourselves is of the most important. And when we stop needing others to be in a certain way, then and only then are we able to actually go into a communication non-violently. Because if I'm expecting something from you, if you have to react in one way, if there's one right answer to what I'm going to say to you, you know, you go in with it, it hurt me. How many times do people not say sorry? They say it 100 other things, but they haven't said, I'm so sorry. And we hold on. It has to be the way I want to hear it. But then, of course, when I say, but you haven't even said I'm sorry, and then they say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Well, no, now it doesn't count because I told you to say it. Wasn't the right way. So this leads us nowhere. So begin with the self. Recognize that what I feel is my responsibility and no one else's. No one's. There is no one on earth whose job it is or responsibility is or role it is to make me feel a certain way or to speak to me in a certain way. That's my responsibility of how I speak to myself and how I react inside, respond inside, interpret inside, perceive inside how the world has treated